Dr. Marcello Sbrocca, and in this video I'm going to talk about Sigurd Rascher style saxophonists, their importance, as well as what I would like to see in the future. So first off, why am I making this video? Well, to me, I have always really admired the Sigurd Rascher style of playing. To me, they have a very that style of playing, those kind of players, have a very unique sound, which is due to their particular equipment, as well as I love Rascher's playing, as well as some of his great students' playing, which I'll talk about more. And Sigurd Rascher was such an important saxophonist. He did so much for classical saxophone, yet I find that his style of playing is kind of going away, as far as I can tell. And I just find that not only to be, a shame, but it's a very different aesthetic, the Rascher style playing. And I think sometimes it's very beautiful and special, and I just think it would be such a shame if that went away, especially after it did so much for classical sax from the beginning. So I'll talk more about all of that in a minute. But let me define what a Rascher saxophonist is. Well, so to start, there were kind of three main classical saxophone pioneers. The first one was Adolphe Sax, who, believe it or not, was the first saxophone professor at the Conservatoire of Paris. A lot of people think Marcel Mule was, but in reality, Marcel Mule was the second. Adolphe Sax was a professor at the Conservatoire of Paris until the saxophone got discontinued because of a war at the time. And then there was a big gap, and then Marcel Mule started it back up. Marcel Mule is the other important saxophonist. And then the third would be Sigurd Rascher. Now, all three of these people were extremely important, but I would argue that Sigurd Rascher got the most amount of important classical saxophone pieces written, or at least some of the most important, most essential classical saxophone pieces, like the Glazunov Concerto or the Ibert Concerto or Concertino, and other pieces like that. Very impressive individual. I've heard things about him that maybe he wasn't the best person. I've heard that from a couple different people, and I'll talk more about that when I get to my correspondence with Jacques that I had, which was one of Sigurd Rascher's greatest students. But anyway, Rascher was, he was a real pioneer. Mule was as well, but Sigurd Rascher was certainly much more active, proactive, and aggressive, which maybe was not so good in certain ways, but certainly has had an everlasting positive effect on saxophone, classical saxophone. So anyway, that's who Sigurd Rascher was. He was 90-something years old when he died. He died, I think it was 2001 or 2, or maybe it was in 1992, I forgot. You can easily look it up, but it wasn't that long ago. But anyway, when I say a Rascher-style saxophonist, it's somebody who either studied with him or plays like him. And another important aspect to that is they have a different setup. The equipment they use is different. They view the saxophone differently, and as far as I can tell, they typically detest the modern saxophone, which is, the vast majority of saxophones. Rascher players will play a Buscher saxophone, which is a very old saxophone, and they'll play them with these mouthpieces that are very bulbous. I don't know the name of the mouthpieces, I apologize, but, it's a very different, the saxophone and the mouthpiece are very different than a modern saxophone. But I believe the key difference really lies with the mouthpiece. Now, in 2015, I emailed Jacques, who died less than a year later, which was shocking. I think he had cancer. When I emailed him, I asked him about studying with Rascher. I told him how much I appreciated his recording of the Concertino da Camera by Jacques Ibert. And he did reply to me, but the first thing he said in his email was, I normally don't write to saxophonists. And I'll talk about why in a moment. But anyway, he was explaining to me, and I'll reference that email several times throughout this video. But he told me in that video, he's got some paper he wrote on the saxophone and why the modern saxophone is, in his eyes, an abomination. And it's not true to Adolphe Sax's original idea of what the saxophone should be. And the main reason why he said that, as far as I can remember, as far as I can tell, was that in the saxophones that the Rascher style saxophonists play, they have those bulbous mouthpieces that I told you about, where a lot of resistance is created. As Mr. Kelly explained to me, modern saxophones don't have the right kind of resistance, or don't have any resistance, whereas these saxophones do, which makes the modern saxophone unlike supposedly any other instrument. He says bassoonists create the resistance either in their mouth or because of the double reeds and things like that. I don't necessarily buy the whole thing. I think that modern saxophone, you create resistance with your voicing, and with the balance of the tip opening and reed strength and things like that. But I've never played one of these Buscher styled saxophones with one of these Rascher styled mouthpieces. I would love to, but I haven't had the opportunity to. But in any case, to him, the modern saxophone as well as the Buscher saxophone with the Rascher styled mouthpiece, they're fundamentally different because of that lack of resistance, which is very interesting. I say I don't totally agree with what he's saying because I think that modern saxophone can be a very beautiful thing. It's apparently and obviously a very beautiful thing. But I do see it as like, well, what if he's onto something? What if there's some potential there that people have just kind of cast aside? Which leads me to kind of my next point, which is, why are there so few Rascher-styled saxophonists now? As far as I can tell, there are very few. I know there's still some professors out there. There's probably some professors in schools I've never heard of. I know that the Rascher Quartet, which I believe is still led by Rascher's daughter, Karina Rascher, they're still playing. They still have, I follow them online, and it seems like they have quite an active performance schedule. They're performing a lot, mainly in Europe. But other than them, I don't know about too many other Rascher-style saxophonists. I know there's Lawrence Guaz in Florida State or something like that. I don't know much about the other saxophonists, but I'm just basing it off of, if you look around and you see who's kind of well known, where the pieces are written, it's almost never, or people who win competitions, not that I care too much about that, but you never see Rascher-style saxophonists. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are none, but it's saying something that it's just so uncommon to see them. Which again I think is a pity, because they really have a unique aesthetic to them, and I just think it would be terrible if that were to entirely go away. I have been told through other people who are older than me, and this can explain why there are so few, but there was kind of a lot of drama between Rascher players and, for lack of a better word, modern players. I'm kind of basically throwing everybody in the category of modern players. But yeah, I was told that there was a lot of arguing, in some saxophone journals. I heard there was a lot of negativity coming from either both sides or the Rascher side. Fortunately, unfortunately, I don't really know much about that. Which is, bad in the sense that I don't really understand the whole thing, but it's good because I'm not really biased. To me, I listen to a recording of Sigurd Rascher or John Edward Kelly, and I don't listen to it with that idea that there's a lot of negativity there. I listen to it like they're just two artists playing. And I'm a saxophonist, and I think that there's something unique about them. And there was also the drama between Marcel Mühl and Sigurd Rascher, which has always been explained to me as kind of a childish dispute or feud between the two. And when I go over some excerpts in a minute with the Ibert Concertino, some of that shows up, mainly in Rascher being, somebody who, as I mentioned earlier, got new pieces written and was really about expanding the possibilities of the saxophone, like playing altissimo, all extended techniques like slap tonguing and all those kinds of things, which were very new at the time. He promoted those, whereas Mühl was very conservative and didn't play altissimo. He does play altissimo in his recording of the Paul Creston Sonata, but otherwise he doesn't play any of the altissimo in the Concertino da Camera, whereas of course Sigurd Rascher does all of it. Anyway, one last thing about that is that I don't know how far that drama goes, because a couple of years ago several years ago, I emailed Jean-Marie Londex, who unfortunately passed away last year, and I emailed him many times over the last decade or so of his life, and he told me that he very much admired Rascher, despite, he was a student of Marcel Mühl, who of course had his little feud with Rascher, which I don't even know much about. But Londex did appreciate Rascher and was going to meet him at a saxophone congress, but they ended up being too busy or something and it didn't happen, which I think is quite tragic. So that's just to show that I don't really know how much to give to the whole drama thing. I don't know if maybe that's why there are so few of them, if it had something to do with that. But it is kind of a real thing. I also recall when I emailed John Edward Kelly, as I mentioned, he talked about, why he thought the saxophone should be like these old saxophones, but he also, in the email, because I told him how much I enjoyed his recording of the Ibert Concertino, he explained to me how and he said it in a rather negative way, but he said he was I'll say it in a more nice way, he was disappointed with the lack of musicality with American classical saxophonists, which at the time, 2015, I was in my second year of college. I just kind of didn't really think much about it. I'd heard about the drama, so I just kind of assumed it was part of that. But I will admit, as somebody who studied in Europe, I do notice the same thing. It's not with every American classical saxophonist, but it is very common that American classical saxophonists don't understand what phrasing is. Which leads me to, and I don't mean that about everybody, but I must admit that I do see that a lot. And I've had lessons with some high-up classical saxophonists, and they don't talk about phrasing or musicality at all. They talk about fingerings and kind of secondary parameters. In that email, John Edward Kelly was also telling me about when he studied with Rascher, what it was like. He said he had a couple lessons a week with Rascher that were 3 hours long each, which is crazy. And he said that he spoke almost entirely of music. Now, when I didn't really understand what phrasing and musicality was, as I define musicality as phrasing and how musical style affects the phrasing, I just kind of thought he was disappointed with the artistry of saxophonists in America. But the older I get, as I mentioned, I do kind of see it. There's a lack of understanding what phrasing really is. Phrasing is where you emphasize notes, where you push and pull and things like that, to be a little vague about it. But he was kind of onto something with that. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But now I would like to make a comparison between, these Rascher-styled saxophones, which is a Busher saxophone with those particular mouthpieces, and modern saxophones, and piano and harpsichord. Now, this is not a perfect comparison. I don't think that these old saxophones are the same thing as harpsichords, and modern saxophones are the same thing as pianos. But there's some similarities to them. And in this video, I'm going to try and see if I can get my point across a little bit by showing two recordings of the Aria from Johann Sebastian Bach's Goldberg Variations. And I'm going to show one recording of it played by a pianist and one played by a harpsichordist. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard piano and harpsichord, but what's the difference? Other than one is big and heavy and one is lighter and almost entirely wood. Well, a piano, the main difference that I'm trying to get across with piano is that the strings are hammered. They're struck by little hammers covered in felt. And the harder you press, the louder it is. And they have a steel frame, and pianos can get very loud and very quiet. Whereas the harpsichord, the strings, the chords are not hammered, but rather they're plucked. And I don't believe that there's a steel frame to them. I believe they're just wood, and they're a lot quieter. Harpsichords have a thing where you can pluck 2 strings instead of 1, or 3 instead of 2, or something to make it louder, or to give the impression that it's louder. But it's not like if you press harder, that it's really going to be louder. If you press softer, that it's really going to be a softer sound. It's kind of like it has a set dynamic for the most part. And they play with certain effects, or they play with certain elements of music, like rubato, to give the impression that they're getting louder or softer. In other words, piano and harpsichord are fundamentally different. They're very similar. One came from the other one, but the big difference is one is big and heavy and the chords are struck. The other one is it's lighter and quieter, and the chords are plucked. And so now I'm going to play a recording of these two keyboardists for you to listen to. Okay, so now you've heard the piano recording. Now I'm trying to choose like a real modern piano take on it, and one that's not very different. But in the recording, I hope you notice that the pianist does a lot with this aria. There's a lot of nuance going on. They're really trying to make the most of the ornaments. They're adding crescendos and decrescendos, and it's very complicated, and it can be very beautiful, and it's a lot of work. You have to be very skilled to do it. But it's very different than the harpsichord version, which I'll play now. Okay, now that you've heard that recording, I want you to focus on, or I'd like to talk about, the difference in how they phrased the piece, how they were musically. They're both excellent musicians playing very musically, but there's some big differences. As I mentioned with the piano, there's a lot of nuance, they're doing a lot with it, whereas on the harpsichord, it's much more straightforward. It's a little faster. The ornaments they really sound like ornaments added on top of a line of music. Whereas in the piano, it's almost like the ornaments are very integrated, and it sounds like one string, it sounds like, a phrase where there are no ornaments. It's like everything is kind of more homogeneous. homogenized. Whereas in the harpsichord one, again, you have kind of the line of music, and then you have the ornaments added on top. They can't do as much nuance because there's no dynamic control. But personally, I kind of like the harpsichord version more, which is kind of neither here nor there. But I typically prefer pieces from the Baroque era played on harpsichord than piano because they're very different. That music makes a lot more sense to me when played on the harpsichord, as that's the instrument it was originally written for. When you listen to the piano version, as I've mentioned a couple times already, there's a lot of nuance, and there's nothing wrong with that, although it's kind of taking this simple piece and, in my opinion, almost doing too much with it. It's just supposed to be a simple melody, but you have these pianists trying to make use of every single note and all of that. And that can be very pretty, and people can admire that. But what I'm trying really to draw your attention to is that the pianist is playing in a way that's very pianistic. They play an instrument with dynamic control, so they play with that. They almost have to play with that. They don't have to, but that's kind of what people do as pianists. Whereas harpsichords don't have that option, so they don't do that. And so they look at the music differently. I think a similar thing can happen with the Rascher style of playing and the more modern style of playing. Next, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show this by some excerpts of in the second movement, in the slow portion of Jacques Ibert's Concertino da Camera. Now this piece, as I mentioned earlier, was dedicated to Sigurd Rascher, and this piece is pretty special. It's not a very easy piece. In fact, even though it's played so much, I think it's quite a difficult piece. But you'll notice if you look at the score, which you can find on IMSLP if you don't already have it, but there's a lot of altissimo in the work. Quite a lot, and it's not easy. Especially in the second movement, you have a long, beautiful phrase that's supposed to be up an octave and it's very long, and it's not easy to play. And it wasn't until Claude Delangle's recording of it, I think there were some other ones, but there were no real major saxophonists who recorded it up an octave. There was a saxophonist, his last name is Black, I forgot. I believe he recorded it, but it's not a recording you can find easily. But anyway, all of those sections with the altissimo are marked ad libitum, as in you don't have to play them up the octave if you don't want to. And the only reason they're written like that is because Marcel Muehl at the time, with his influence he had at, I believe it was Biodot, I forgot, or maybe Leduc, he got all of the ad libitums written in, and if you hear his recording of it, and many other French saxophonists' recording of it, they don't play any of it up an octave. Some do part of it, some do none of it, like Muehl. And when I was a kid playing Concertino da Camera and listening to recordings of it, I was always like, does anybody ever actually play this piece with the altissimo in it? Or is that just kind of something that was written in but everybody wrote it off as being too hard? Well, I remember I was a senior in high school and I heard for the first time the recording of the Concertino da Camera by John Edward Kelly, which, in my opinion, was one of Sigurd Rascher's greatest students and was an excellent musician. And I'm so grateful that I was able to contact him before he died. I had no idea he had cancer. I also know from the email that he normally does not reply to saxophonists. That was the first thing he told me. But because of the nature of my question, and probably because I phrased it in a nice way, he wrote back to me, which I appreciate very much to this day. But anyway, when I heard his recording, especially of the second movement in the slow part, it blew my mind. It's still one of the most beautiful things I've heard on classical saxophone. Not only do I love the second movement of the Concertino da Camera, because I think it's so beautiful, but I just couldn't believe that somebody finally played it. There was a recording of a saxophonist finally playing it up an octave. Later on in my life, I would hear a recording of Sigurd Rascher playing it, but that at the time was very difficult to find. But not only did John Edward Kelly play it up the octave, but it sounds beautiful. And this is what I'm trying, this is kind of really the whole point of this video, is when Rascher style saxophonists play altissimo, there's a certain quality to it that is so hard to find with a modern saxophone. It's so much more, it's just so beautiful. I'm not going to put down modern saxophone playing. For a long time, modern saxophonists never, wouldn't play altissimo like that because they couldn't control it. And I think that's not because they were inept, and that Rascher players were just so much better, but I have a strong feeling it had something to do with that different equipment that I was talking about earlier. But then one day, I heard the recording of Claude Delangle. And I was so excited when he was playing the second movement, and he goes to the F sharp, and he's actually playing it up the octave, and he continues to play the whole thing up the octave. I was so excited to hear that, because I had never heard a French style or modern saxophonist play that up the octave. So I was so happy to hear that when I was a kid. But I must admit, a part of me still, and how Claude plays it, which I'll go and I'll play excerpts of these two in a minute, but how Claude plays it is very good. It's very accurate. It's marked, I believe, as mezzo forte, and he does a very good job of maintaining that. It has a very delicate quality to it that's very different than Kelly's, but it's beautiful. When John Edward Kelly plays it, to me, he plays a little louder than mezzo forte, and it's not quite as delicate sounding, for better or worse. Mr. Kelly explained it to me that, none of the piece should be written up an octave, and the reason why, especially in that moment, is because when you don't play it up an octave, you're playing lower than the trumpets, and orchestrally it doesn't make sense, and I still think it sounds good down an octave, but I certainly prefer it when it's played well up an octave. So without further ado, I'm going to play those two recordings. I'm going to start with Claude's. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed listening to that. I think that's a wonderful recording of this piece of music, and to me it's historically significant because it's a French saxophonist playing it up the octave. Before I discuss it, now I want to go on to John Edward Kelly's recording of it. Okay, so now that you've heard both recordings, maybe you can start to see where I'm coming from when I show the recording of the harpsichord and the piano. It's not quite as different. It's not a perfect comparison, but you can kind of see that the timbre of a Rascher style saxophonist, it changes altissimo. It's the timbre when they play altissimo is much more similar to when they're playing normally. Whereas when you have a modern saxophonist playing altissimo, it can start to sound quite different. And I know from experience that it's very difficult to make them more homogeneous. Now, I don't doubt Mr. Kelly's skills and the hard work that he put into playing the saxophone, but I would not be surprised if it's a little bit easier on that instrument. But in any case, to me, that's how John Edward Kelly plays that phrase there is one of my favorite saxophone recordings of all time. I just think it's so beautiful. So I hope you have enjoyed that, and I hope that every modern saxophonist hears that. I do think he plays a little too loud. Later on in the piece, he omits some of the articulation, which I think is incorrect. Maybe he had a reason for it. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I don't know. But in any case, I just think that's such a beautiful moment, and it's because of that moment, as well as some of the other excellent recordings of Jennifer Kelly, that I really don't like the idea that people, are unaware of that style of playing and that style of saxophone. Okay. And so, to me, and years ago, Rascher, French saxophonists could never play like Claude did there. So that's very commendable too. And I think very important, and I think when you hear a lot of good modern saxophonists play, they do it, and they play it very well. So I think that whole quarrel that Rascher saxophonists had towards modern players is kind of, it's passé, and I don't really think it's there anymore. But I still think that there's a beautiful timbre to be embraced in the Rascher style of playing. But another difference would be, not only is the timbre different, but I always find that Rascher style saxophonists play quieter, which on one hand you can say is not as good, because a really good modern player can play very loud and very quiet. They can cut through a whole orchestra. They can do all these amazing things, which makes them very versatile. But at the same time, a lot of people complain that the saxophone's too loud, whereas a Rascher style saxophone is not, and there's something to that. There's some more potential there that I wish people would explore more. Now, one thing I mean is that people don't have to go out and buy a Rascher style saxophone or a mouthpiece, but it's like I wish that people were more aware of it, and they would try and see how the different kind of timbre that might be possible even with a modern saxophone and mouthpiece. I know when I play altissimo, I do sometimes try and imitate that, just because otherwise it gets a little stiff sounding or a little hard, and whereas when you hear Kelly do it, it's very angelic and beautiful and free, and it's just, again, very special, to me at least. However, despite my adoration for this Rascher style of playing, I do think there are some issues. Yes, of course, if you can't play as loud, that does limit you. But also, I find it sad that, in the beginning, Rascher was about extended techniques, expanding what was possible for the saxophone, getting pieces written for the saxophone, to the point where I think he was maybe overly aggressive, but was very beneficial in the long run. But now when you look at Rascher players, it's like they're still playing these old saxophones. It's sad to see, and the French saxophonists or the modern saxophonists, not just French, we're doing the new stuff. We're getting the pieces written. Things have switched. Whereas I wish that the Rascher style players would. It's not so much that they need to get with the times. It's so passive aggressive. It's that I wish they would let things evolve a little bit. It's wonderful to embrace these old saxophones, but why can't we create new saxophones, or at least, because that's asking quite a lot to make a new saxophone. But I wish they could create modern mouthpieces, or modern Rascher-style mouthpieces. Rascher-style mouthpieces that check those boxes that Jennifer Kelly talks about in his paper and that email he sent me, but have a little bit more of a modern aesthetic to them. The French make a big deal about letting things evolve, whereas I feel like a lot of Rascher players have kind of let things become static, which I think is maybe why we don't see them as much anymore. So anyway, I'd like to conclude this video by saying that I admire greatly Sigurd Rascher and his whole legacy, and Sigurd Rascher style saxophonists, and I wish I would hear more of them. But I also greatly admire most of the rest of the saxophone world, and I wish the two would be I wish modern players would be more aware of Rascher players and how important and special they are, not just what they've done, but in terms of how different they are and how we don't ever hear saxophone playing like that. And I wish, in other words, I wish that we would evolve and integrate some of that into our playing, and vice versa, if that's even possible. So anyway, if you have any questions or comments, or if you're a Rascher style player and you'd like to kindly correct me on some things, please leave those comments down below. And thank you so much for watching.